Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mokwariola. Africa is often regarded as a continent where, between the burden of development and the failure of government, necessary conversations ensure that regional summits are either mere talk shops or serious rallying points for progress. For a country 3 hours ahead of the Greenwich Mean Time and 7 years behind on the Gregorian calendar, instance was of no significance when leaders began to converge for the 20th African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on key issues affecting Africa that should top the agenda at the 30th African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report now, and Africa Today will continue. Welcome on board.
Corruption has become one of the most urgent issues needing to be solved in Africa, and the African Union is finding ways to best tackle the scourge. Currently, the 30th summit of the African Union is holding in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital, and the theme for this year is winning the fight against corruption, a sustainable path to Africa's transformation.
I think the theme is very important as we consider the corruption also as one of the triggers of conflicts, because overall it's about governance, and in governance we have political governance, we have economical governance. And it is important that we really address this issue very seriously.
In 2016, a Corruption Watch report indicated that the general types of corruption over the years centers on abuse of power, bribery, and then procurement corruption. In South Africa, the public protector serves as the anti-corruption watchdog, but the lack of resources has made it hard to sustain remarkable progress.
The G5 Sahel Joint Force will tackle terrorism, instability, human trafficking and drug smuggling in its troubled region. And the multinational Joint Task Force against Boko Haram is also tackling terrorism in the Lake Chad Basin. But these operations need the support of the entire international community.
While many countries in Africa have had their economy deeply affected by corruption, there have been calls for leaders to do the right thing to better their nations. Meanwhile, African leaders have also signaled the urgency to combat militant attacks that have been a major threat to peace, security, and development in some parts of the continent. Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, has praised the G5 Sahel Joint Force for tackling militancy in the region.
The rise of national egoism, the triggering of xenophobia, and the rejection of the other are all significant symptoms and signals as if the values of solidarity, equality, and justice are receding. We are, of course, pressing our concern in the face of this development to restate our commitment to the values of solidarity, tolerance, and mutual respect. Humanity is at stake.
To strengthen the region, African Union Chairman Moussa Faki says member states will continue to work in solidarity for the development of the continent.
Welcome back. Africa is on the spotlight as leaders meet in Ethiopia for the 30th African Union Summit and discuss key issues which border on fighting corruption in Africa, self-financing of the African Union, continental free trade and security. Joining me in the studio now on Africa Today, I have Alester Wilcox, political analyst and social commentator. And on Skype, I have Dr. Sylvester Odion, Associate Professor, Political Science Department, Lagos State University in Nigeria. Good to have you gentlemen on the program.
Thank you very much, Esther.
Well, let me begin with you, Alester. Now, the issues topping the agenda range from fighting corruption in Africa, independent financing for the AU, political and, of course, security issues surrounding the continent today. But now, what are your thoughts on the African Union Summit? That's the 30th African Union Summit and the issues it seeks to address in order to pursue the Africa we want.
Thank you very much. Once again, good evening. The issues are not strange. Every of the summit that has been held since the name was changed from OAU to AU revolves around these issues of corruption, insurgency, security, terrorist finance, and all whatnot. So the issues have revolved around them. Now, to what extent have the past summits achieved reasonable progress in these issues are what we should be concerned about. Because sincerely speaking, these are the things, you have the speeches, you hear the delegations, some very large delegations. Some of them are just sleeping, delegates and all whatnot. Some are just what I would call psychological delegates and all whatnot. So I don't think there is really serious business in Africa that will have resulted to something that is tangible. And that is why the country remains where we are. We have been talking and talking, but really walking the talk has been the issue.
So this is a clear case of political will, not really...
The political will and the fact that institutional frameworks are very, very weak. Institutional governance is very weak in Africa. The moment the communiques are issued at the end of this program. Plans of actions are there. Timelines are there. But by the time you get back home, what do you do with them? You come back home to face the challenges. You forget the clicking of glasses, the smiles, the handshakes, and you come back home to face the same challenges that you have left undone. So if domestically, each African leader in each jurisdiction has taken up the issue of good governance as a serious issue, has taken up the issue of minimization, of fighting corruption as a serious issue, has taken up the issues of creating the environment that will not breed insecurity and insurgency, I don't think those issues should be featuring. Look at other blocks in the world. Look at the EU. Look at the South American grouping. Look at how serious they are addressing issues. Look at the EU East now, and so they are advancing. So every day there are new issues to meet, and they are all going up from the ones that they've all resolved. Another. Yes, to another. But in Africa, it's still the same. They might change the language, change the coloration, but the issues are revolving around the same issues. And
it shouldn't be so, actually. But Sylvester Odion, do you have the same position here as posited by Lester Wilcox?
Yes, I think some of the points he has made are quite, relevant. You can't put them aside. But I think the point is to really make is that when you are expecting much from African leaders, it's also to ignore, the foundational structure of the African state. I think that what African countries enjoy today is just mere juridical sovereignty. They cannot, exercise that sovereignty in terms of economic potentials, in terms of, political potentials and the rest of them. The liberal democracy we have in much of Africa today is Western driven, And so when you talk about the economic, basis of Africa countries, is still externally dependent. We produce the normal cash crops, and we export. In the case of countries with oil like Nigeria, we export crude, we can refine, and of course we extract rents from the sale of crude and all of that. So that is the position in which Africa is. Now, Africa has become more fragile, also because of the end of bipolarity. The world is in a very fluid situation in search of an international anchor, and so we have not been able to get our acts right in this context. So the issue that we have addressed essentially since the end of bipolarity is this question about good governance.
All right, let's quickly look at this issue that was also discussed in the African Union, which was corruption. And in the fight against corruption, Nigeria's president, that's Muhammadu Buhari, was selected as the AU's anti-corruption year champion, just at the AU summit just held yesterday. But if that is the case, what measures do you think can be applied here to successfully deal with this issue of corruption? Because according to the president, he says corruption or fighting graft won't be easy, if not at least he acknowledged that. But corruption, like he also said, fights back. So what ways do you think governments in Africa can deal with this system, or this issue, successfully?
When you say corruption fights back, it is because African leaders are addressing the pathology. Nobody has, tried to address the economic basis of nation building, of development. and you begin to talk about chasing illicit funds and the rest of them, when the fundamental structure engendering, corruption in most African countries have not been addressed. Don't forget that even when we talk about the problems and deficit in the continent, there is no indigenous capital in Africa. All capital accumulation are through the state. And therefore, you then have state, leaders that are almost like, lords unto themselves. And so those same leaders are the people composing the AU, and they are the people discussing corruption. So there is an integrity gap for the African leaders to deal with the question of corruption. If a man has just been chosen from Nigeria, the Nigerian leadership has been chosen as the icon for the fight against corruption in the continent. And today, Nigeria is almost in a total state of instability, by policies engendered by the same person. And maybe that's a way of, looking at corruption from a different perspective. Maybe political corruption this time, and not just illicit, flow of resources out of the continent.
All right, that's your thought for now. We need to go on a very quick break. You're watching Africa Today, and we're looking at key issues affecting Africa that should top the agenda at the 30th African Union Summit in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. In an attempt to fulfill a far-reaching mandate, the African Union signed a new agreement with the United Nations to improve their collaboration on a range of global issues. Now, the new AU-UN framework would work towards the implementation of the Agenda 2063 and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as Africa remains key to solving global problems. Now, Lester, let's still look at this issue of corruption, which bothers a lot, in the minds of most Africans today, because the Economic Commission of Africa says that for every year, about $148 billion are drained, out of the continent through various corrupt practices, which represent about 25% of Africa's GDP growth. Now, how do you think, even though there's a little bit of commitment here from different African countries, how do you think the countries in Africa can successfully deal with this issue called corruption?
Yeah, it's gratifying for me that Nigerian president, talking about President Muhammadu Buhari, is being chosen, is being seen at this point as one of the champions of Africa, of fighting Africa. We might have a different views about it all, but the fact is, this is somebody that made fighting of corruption as his cardinal objective. Now, domestically, we might say And I'm happy that his colleagues are seeing some signs of what his commitments are on that issue. Domestically, we might play politics and say it's sectional, it's this, it's that, it's not from his cabinet and all one. But the fact is, they are in that considered effort. And so, cascading that to other African countries. I know that there are some other African countries that have done things in the past, like Ghana. I'm sure that successive administration in Ghana, right from the time of Jerry Rawlings, had tried all that they could, and with the people's cooperation. Now, whatever that any African leader will do, there must be that institutional framework domestically, internally, to be able to have a buy-in. Now, it will be devoid of politics, it will be devoid of ethnic sentiment, it will be devoid of economic sentiments, it will be devoid of any other consideration. Because number one, the issue of corruption, let's take Nigeria for example, has robbed us of so many things. It doesn't have ethnic color, it doesn't have tribal color, it doesn't have religious color. All it has is that it has robbed us of good standard of living, good roads, good healthcare delivery system, good education. Even as Professor Odion, I'm sure he will have been happier to have a better environment to teach. But of course, the incidence of corruption has horrible of those two. They want that total buying. So the only panacea for success is the buying of the people to make the enemies of states, that is those who have pilfered our resources. Yeah, Professor Odion is talking about a foundational framework of what. Look, those things are academics. Because the fact remains that nobody today does not feel the impacts or the consequences of corruption. So whatever may be your economic status, whatever may be your gains or non-gains or pecuniary interest in any of these illicit funds and corrupt practices, that should be secondary. Number one is the fact that we look at the bigger picture. And so there must be that total buy-in. So this is for every African countries. Nigeria is not the only country that has poverty. I mean, staring us in our faces. Even in the developed countries, there are homeless people. There are poor people. The leader of opposition in Britain just said something yesterday that I listened that the day he becomes prime minister, he will buy 8,500 new homes for the homeless because there are people who sleep on the streets. So so poverty is not a panacea. I mean, it's not a license to endorse or to continue to say, oh, because we get crumbs that satisfy our immediate economic needs of buying a Congo of Gari or buying a Congo of rice, that we should not unite together in supporting whatever government in whatever jurisdiction in order to tackle the monster.
All right.
Throw down religion, throw down politics, throw down ethnicity, and know that there's a common enemy that transcends right from the center to your local government. So if there's corruption in your local government, then it's as worse, then it's as bad as it is in the center. All
right, Odion, there's this issue of political interference now, of corruption agencies. Now, how do you think these agencies can be insulated from any level of political interference, as it were?
We might talk about, autonomizing those anti-corruption agencies. But again, don't forget that they are creation of the political structures, of the political actors. They create them. And so the extent to which they can fight or push their goals depends on the level of the measure of autonomy that they enjoy at the end of the day. That is the point to make. But let me take you back to one point. And I made the point that all that we are doing today, whether at the continental level or local level, is that we are addressing the pathologies of corruption. That's what we are addressing. We are not addressing the root cause of corruption. Insofar as you run away from the root cause of corruption, you can't get an answer. I quite agree with my colleague there that corruption has no color. It's devastating and it's disconcerting for most of the things that we can do in terms of providing services for our people, social facilities for our people, and all of that. But you have to deal with the structure. Why is it today that in Nigeria we regard, for example, politics as a do or die affair? Because you have what I would call a resources which is a kind of unearned income for the Nigerian state. So every state actor dips, his own hand or her hand into that tea. And that is, of course, is the basis of corruption in Nigeria. I mean the petroleum, sector in Nigeria, which is the basis for our foreign, exchange for the country at the end of the day.
All right, let's quickly look at. All right, I have to come in here, Odion. Let's quickly move away from corruption now. Let's still look at another issue that was also discussed also at the 38th AU summit. This is about independent financing now on the part of the AU. It seeks to, do things on its own, being independent of any other bloc in the region, as it were. But is it really possible now for the AU to finance its activities, where we have member states having to experience, or African countries having to experience large cases of insecurity and all of that? How do you think, or what's the possibility now of the African Union being independently financed so that it can handle these things on its own without depending on the West?
That was the first point I made, talking about African countries having juridical independence, because the international institutions allows for sovereignty of nations, equality of sovereignty of nations. So countries exist. We do not have the resources to exercise independent policy at the international level. But the point that should be made is that in terms of the illicit flow of resources out of the continent, if we can exhibit commitment on the part of the leadership in Africa, it is quite possible for countries to pool resources together to finance the activities of the Organization of African Union at the end of the day. So that is possible. It is possible to pool resources to do that.
But right now, as we speak, we have only 21 African countries out of 51 that have implemented it so far. Do you think there's this level of willingness on the part of other member states to contribute for the independence of the African Union?
The willingness is there, but don't forget that most African countries are very, very poor. Only a few countries you can point to that have, the economic resources or financial leverage, to be able to meet their continental obligation as far as the African Union is concerned.
All right, Lester, do you share the same position as Odion?
Yeah, I think it's lack of ingenuity in the part of African leaders or the African Union in financing its operations. Looking too much to the West or becoming a bride, a beautiful bride to the West. For instance, the AU Secretariat was built by the government of China as a donation because of their interest, their renewed interest in Africa. These other world powers will come in, not because they love you, but because they have an agenda to gain things out of you. Today, China seems to be the biggest trading bloc in Africa. And so by doing that, they are opening up they're making other countries the entire continent to open up their economies for them to exploit. So now it takes African leaders to be ingenious. And you don't need to be like the others. You cut your coat according to your size. These are the same people that belongs to so many organizations. You cut down. For instance, Nigeria had to disengage itself from about 100 and something organizations that they felt they don't have need for during when this government came into power. So African countries have put their hands, have taken too much more than they can bite by belonging to various organizations that have no relevance. So if African countries or leaders streamline their operations, streamline their activities, know what is relevant for them, and they be able to pull the resources together, cut down your expenditures, cut down the things that you don't need, take a holistic view, a scientific view of your operations, and know which ones that are relevant. By so doing, then you'll be able to grow as you will. Then you do some form of investment. What stop from the AU from going to investments in terms of technology and all whatnot that will be beneficial to other African countries, and then sell these things to them, and they make money, and they have resources to fund them. So these are issues that African leaders should take serious. It's not just to go and click glass, carry old leaders. For me, it's very embarrassing. Have you seen in EU? Have you seen past leaders of EU attending EU meetings? But in Africa, you discover that the leaders that have left power decades ago, I saw Abdul Salam so that is like a jamboree. So it's not serious business. It's like a jamboree, an elders forum, or something that just come in like a village square. So they must get their ass together and begin to really have serious discussions
in order to find a serious way to get out of African quagmire. I think that's the way to go.
Thank you very much, Lester Wilcox, for your thoughts and position on this very issue. Appreciate it. And as well, Sylvester Odion, thank you very much for your contributions on Africa Today.
Thank you.
Year after year, summit after summit, Africa remains a continent literally moving on the spot as political and economic challenges continue to hold back the continent from achieving sustainable development in 2030 to attaining unprecedented growth in 2063. Leadership actions must match developmental ambitions so that the hope of a better continent in future can begin to find expression in the present tense. And that is our package for today, but don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG and follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. On to the next one, I am Esther Mokwariola, and always remember, this is Africa. Bye for now.